It was supposed to be a quiet, relaxing weekend away from the city. Just four friends, a couple of tents, and the deep, serene woods of Pine Hollow. They had chosen the location based on a vague recommendation from a friend who called it untouched by tourists. It was perfect. Isolated, quiet, and vast. Jacob, the unofficial leader of the group, scouted ahead to find the perfect camping spot. He was accompanied by his girlfriend, Mia, and their two friends, Alex and Nicole. They eventually found a clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a small stream running nearby. The group quickly set up camp, joking around as they pitched their tents and prepared the campfire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to take on a different character. The laughter that once echoed off the trees was swallowed by the thickening darkness. The only light was the glow of their campfire, casting long dancing shadows into the forest. The conversation turned to the usual creepy stories, each trying to outdo the other with tales of ghosts, cryptids, and strange disappearances. It was Alex who first mentioned the local legend, one he had found online while researching the area. "Ever heard of the Whispering Pines?" he asked, his voice low. Jacob rolled his eyes. "Sounds made up, man." "Well, it's not," Alex insisted. "There's a story about this forest. They say that anyone who camps here will start hearing whispers, like someone is trying to call them deeper into the woods. And if you follow the voice, you never come back." Mia laughed, though it sounded a bit forced. "Great. Just what we needed to hear right before sleeping out here." Nicole shivered, rubbing her arms. "You're just trying to freak us out," Alex smirked. "Believe what you want. Just don't wander off if you hear something calling your name." The group eventually fell silent, letting the sounds of the forest take over. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the crackling of the campfire filled the air. They decided to call it a night, snuggling into their sleeping bags inside the tents. Hours passed in an uneasy quiet. The forest felt alive with a strange energy, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Suddenly, Mia shot up in her sleeping bag. She thought she had heard something, a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was a soft whisper, her name carried on the wind. "Mia?" She strained her ears, heart pounding, but the whisper faded. She shook Jacob awake. "Did you hear that?" He groggily sat up. "Hear what?" Someone said my name." Jacob listened, but all he could hear was the usual night noises. "It's just the wind. Go back to sleep." But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, listening intently. Then she heard it again, clearer this time. "Mia? Come here." Her heart skipped a beat. She sat up and looked at Jacob, who was already back to sleep. Slowly she unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The forest was pitch black, save for the faint light of the dying campfire. She saw nothing, but the whisper came again, louder now. "Mia, follow me." It was impossible to ignore. She stepped out of the tent, looking around. The voice seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. She hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. Maybe it was one of her friends playing a trick. She glanced back at the tents before stepping cautiously into the forest. The darkness swallowed her as she walked further away from the campsite. The whispering grew louder, almost guiding her through the trees. She couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to echo from all directions. Suddenly, she realized she had no idea how far she had gone or which direction she had come from. The whispering stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the forest. Mia's breath hitched. She turned around in circles, trying to find her way back, but everything looked the same. Panic set in. "Hello?" she called out, but her voice sounded small and lost. No response. Just as she was about to start running back, she heard it again. But this time, it wasn't her name. It was something much darker, a guttural whisper she couldn't understand. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing among the trees, its eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. Mia's scream was cut short as she tripped over a root, falling hard onto the ground. She scrambled up, breathing heavily, but the figure was gone. The whispering resumed, louder now, like it was right beside her ear. She turned to run back to the camp, only to realize she didn't know which way to go. Her surroundings felt foreign, like the forest had changed while she wasn't looking. The whispers became a cacophony, drowning out her thoughts. Back at the campsite, Jacob stirred awake. He glanced at Mia's empty sleeping bag and frowned. He crawled out of the tent and looked around. "Mia?" he called out quietly, trying not to wake the others. No answer. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but it barely pierced the dense black. He felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't like Mia to wander off alone. He moved toward the edge of the clearing, calling her name louder this time. "Mia?" A voice answered back, but it wasn't hers. It was a low, distorted whisper. "Jacob, come closer." He felt frozen. He had never heard anything like it. It sounded almost like her, but wrong. He backed away slowly, turning to wake Alex and Nicole. "Guys, wake up. Something's not right," he whispered urgently. They stirred, looking confused. "What's going on?" Nicole asked, rubbing her eyes. "Mia's gone." "I heard something in the woods," Jacob said, his voice shaky. Alex grabbed his flashlight. "Let's go find her." As they entered the forest, the whispers started again, calling each of their names in turn. It was like the voice knew them intimately, pulling at their deepest fears. The whispers twisted, overlapping until they couldn't tell which direction they were coming from. Suddenly, Nicole screamed. They swung their flashlights in her direction to see her staring at a tree. Carved into the bark were their names, each crossed out except Mia's. "What the hell?" Alex breathed, stepping closer. Before they could react, the whispering stopped, replaced by a shrill, inhuman scream that echoed through the woods. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shudder as if the very forest was alive and angry. They ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperately trying to find their way back to the camp. But the forest had changed. Nothing looked familiar. The shadows seemed to reach out, grabbing at their clothes. They could hear footsteps behind them, but when they turned, there was nothing there. Finally, they broke through the tree line into their campsite. The fire had died, leaving only smoldering embers. The relief of being back was short-lived. Mia was standing by the tents, her back to them. "Mia!" Jacob shouted, running toward her. She turned slowly. Her eyes were vacant, staring right through him. Her mouth moved, but the voice that came out was not hers. "Leave, or stay forever." The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the cold air. The shadows around Mia seemed to writhe and pulse. Jacob reached out to her, but she stepped back, fading into the darkness as if swallowed by the forest itself. They didn't wait. Grabbing what they could, the three of them bolted for the car, leaving everything else behind. The whispers followed them all the way to the road, where they finally collapsed into the vehicle and sped off without looking back. To this day, they never speak of what happened in Pine Hollow, and they never found Mia. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, they swear they can still hear her calling their names. The thick canopy of the forest seemed to swallow the sunlight as Brian, Sarah, Kevin, and Lily made their way deeper into the woods. They had planned this camping trip for months, a chance to escape the grind of city life and enjoy the beauty of nature. Brian, the group's self-proclaimed outdoorsman, led the way with confidence, though none of them could shake the eerie feeling that settled in their stomachs as they ventured deeper into the isolated wilderness known as Blackwood Forest. By the time they reached the clearing where they intended to set up camp, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like fingers trying to grasp at their ankles. They worked quickly, setting up the tents and gathering firewood. The air was crisp, and the forest was unnaturally quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves far off in the distance. Kevin, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "You guys know this place is haunted, right? They say a group of campers went missing here years ago. Some say they still haunt these woods." Lily rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, Kevin. Can we go one night without your spooky stories?" He grinned. "What? It's tradition. Besides, it's not like anyone here actually believes in goats, right? Right?" But his words hung in the air, a heavy silence following them. Brian shook his head. "Let's just get the fire going. It's getting dark." As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around them. The flickering campfire was the only source of light, casting their faces in sharp relief. The conversation turned to lighter topics, and soon they were laughing, the earlier tension starting to melt away. But then, without warning, the fire dimmed, as if an unseen hand had covered it. The laughter stopped. Sarah glanced around. "Did anyone else feel that?" Kevin frowned. "Feel what?" "The temperature just dropped, like, a lot." She rubbed her arms, suddenly shivering. Brian poked at the fire, trying to revive it. "It's probably just a cold front. It happens sometimes at night in the woods." But even as he said it, he knew something was off. The fire flared back up, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into their very bones. Then they heard it, a faint sound like someone whispering. It was impossible to make out the words, but it was there, a soft hissing voice carried on the wind. They all fell silent, straining to listen. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide. Kevin tried to laugh it off, but it came out as a nervous chuckle. "It's just the wind. Or maybe an animal." But deep down, he didn't believe that. None of them did. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around them, yet the forest remained empty. Then they heard it, a snap of a twig, like a footstep, just beyond the light of the fire. Brian stood up, grabbing the flashlight. "Who's out there?" he called into the darkness. Silence. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. Then the whispering returned, closer this time, and distinctly saying, "Leave." A cold wave of fear washed over the group. Kevin jumped up. "All right, who's messing with us? Is this some kind of prank?" But it was clear from their faces that no one was joking. The whispering continued, growing louder, almost angry. They could make out a few words now. "Get out!" Sarah's voice quivered. "I don't like this, Brian. We should leave." He nodded, his bravado gone. "Pack up. We're leaving now." As they scrambled to gather their things, the whispering intensified, surrounding them like a cloud of voices. Then Kevin froze, staring into the forest. "Guys, do you see that?" They turned to where he was pointing. Just beyond the tree line, two pale, glowing eyes stared back at them. The shape of a shadowy figure slowly emerged, tall and thin, almost blending into the darkness of the trees. It stood there, unmoving, watching them. "What the hell is that?" Lily gasped, backing away. Before anyone could answer, the figure took a step forward. The whispering ceased, replaced by an unnatural silence. Then, with a voice that seemed to echo in their minds, it spoke clearly. "You should not be here." Brian felt his legs turn to jelly, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it seemed to melt back into the darkness, disappearing from view. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. The air felt heavy, pressing down on them. "Run!" Sarah screamed, breaking the silence. Without another word, they all bolted, leaving behind their tents and belongings. The forest around them seemed to twist and shift as they ran, the path back to the car almost unrecognizable. Branches clawed at their clothes, the ground seemed to suck at their feet, and the whispering voices returned, more frantic, almost pleading. "Leave. Leave now." They burst out onto the dirt road where their car was parked, panting and sweating despite the cold. They didn't stop to look back. Brian fumbled with the keys, thus finally unlocking the car. They piled in, and he floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the forest. As they drove away, the whispering faded, replaced by the sound of the wind rushing past the car. They didn't speak, the terror of what they had experienced hanging over them like a dark cloud. It wasn't until they were miles away that Lily finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Brian admitted, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But whatever it was, it didn't want us there. The rest of the drive was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. When they finally reached the city, the comfort of civilization did little to ease their nerves. They agreed to meet the next day to discuss what had happened, but deep down, they all knew they would never set foot in Blackwood Forest again. The next morning, Brian awoke early, still haunted by the events of the previous night. He decided to search online for any stories about the forest, hoping to find an explanation. He found a forum discussing local legends, and his heart sank as he read a post from a year ago. "Don't camp in Blackwood Forest. My friends and I heard voices telling us to leave. We saw something, a figure in the woods. It's not a place for the living. If you hear the whispers, run. And if you see it, you're already too late." The last line sent a chill down his spine. They say the forest claims those who don't heed its warnings. Once it calls your name, it never stops. Brian shut his laptop, his hands shaking. He knew they had narrowly escaped something beyond their understanding. And as he sat there in the quiet of his apartment, he heard it again, faint but unmistakable, carried on an invisible wind that seemed to blow through the room. The forest was dense and dark, the kind of place where the silence felt almost alive. Jake, Emily, Nick, and Laura were college friends who had decided on a weekend camping trip to a remote area known as Pine Hollow. It was said to be one of the most beautiful spots for stargazing, but it was also notorious for being hard to reach and eerily quiet. They were looking for adventure, a story to tell, but they had no idea what was waiting for them out there. They set up camp as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to dance between the trees. The fire crackled, giving off a faint warmth that did little to fight off the sudden chill that settled in. The sky was clear, revealing a blanket of stars above them. It should have been peaceful, but Emily couldn't shake a sense of unease. It felt like they were being watched. "Did you guys hear the legend about this place?" Nick asked with a smirk as he poked at the fire. "They say a cult used to meet out here in the woods. People would go missing and no one would ever find their bodies. Some say their spirits still haunt these woods, looking for their next victim." "Seriously, Nick?" Laura rolled her eyes. "Can we not start with creepy stories already? We just got here." Jake laughed. "Oh, come on, Laura. It's all part of the camping experience. Besides, it's just a story to scare off tourists." But Emily wasn't convinced. The forest had an oppressive atmosphere that made her skin crawl. It was like the darkness between the trees was thicker than usual, hiding something they couldn't see. As they continued talking, a rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. Everyone went silent, straining to listen. The rustling grew louder, closer, like something was moving toward them. Jake grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the noise. "Probably just a deer," he said, trying to sound confident. But the beam of light revealed nothing, just the dense undergrowth of the forest floor. Suddenly, the rustling stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on them. Then, without warning, a low whisper filled the air, a voice so faint it was almost lost in the wind. "Leave this place." The voice was icy, echoing as if it were coming from all directions at once. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Did you guys hear that?" Nick nodded, his face pale. "It's probably someone messing with us," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. He got up and scanned the area with his flashlight. "Hello? Who's out there?" No answer. The only sound was the crackling of their campfire. "We should pack up and leave," Emily said, her voice shaky. "I don't like this." Jake scoffed. "Are you serious? It's just some prankster trying to scare us." But before anyone could respond, the whispering came again, louder this time. "You don't belong here." Nick swung his flashlight around wildly, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was speaking. The light flickered, then went out completely. He smacked it, trying to get it to work, but it was dead. "Great," he muttered. "Now the batteries are out." But something was wrong. Emily felt a strange sensation, like the ground was vibrating beneath her feet. She looked around, noticing the others felt it too. The fire suddenly dimmed, and a cold wind blew through the clearing, extinguishing it entirely. They were plunged into darkness. "Everyone, grab your stuff. We're leaving," Jake ordered, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. He pulled out his phone for light, but the screen flickered and then went black. What the hell? All their phones had died. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew thick with a strange, metallic smell. Emily's breath came out in white puffs, as if it were the middle of winter. Then they saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its face shrouded in darkness. The outline of its body was barely visible, like a shadow given form. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at them with hollow eyes. "Who are you?" Laura shouted, her voice breaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed directly at them. The whispering returned, now a chorus of voices, overlapping and indistinguishable, filling their ears and making it impossible to think. "Run," Emily whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "We need to run." They didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing whatever they could, they sprinted toward the direction they had come from, the path barely visible in the darkness. The whispering followed them, growing louder, echoing in their heads. The forest seemed to change as they ran, the path twisting and turning in ways they didn't remember. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands trying to grab them. Emily could feel something cold on the back of her neck, like icy breath. They stumbled and fell multiple times, panic making their legs weak. Laura tripped over a root and cried out in pain, clutching her ankle. Nick helped her up, and they hobbled together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. When they finally burst out of the tree line and into the small dirt lot where their car was parked, it felt like they had been running for hours. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before finally unlocking the doors. They piled into the car, and Jake started the engine. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the road ahead. But standing at the edge of the woods was the figure again, its face still hidden, its hand still pointing at them. "Go, go, go!" Emily screamed. Jake slammed his foot on the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as they sped away. The figure didn't move, just watched them leave. The whispering faded into the distance, replaced by the roar of the engine. They didn't stop driving until they reached the nearest town. Only then did they pull over, panting, and looked back. The woods were far behind them, but the feeling of being watched lingered. "Did everyone see that?" Nick asked, his voice barely a whisper. They all nodded. No one spoke for a long moment, the weight of what they had experienced settling in. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "We're never going back there," he said firmly. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. Emily glanced out the window, half expecting to see the figure standing there in the shadows. "It didn't want us there," she said quietly, "and I don't think it's done with us yet." For the rest of their lives, they could never forget the whispers, the figure, or the feeling of being watched. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, they could swear they still heard the voice from Pine Hollow, whispering their names, calling them back to the woods. The night sky was pitch black, blanketed by thick clouds that blotted out the moonlight. 5 friends, Mark, Sarah, Chris, Megan, and Tom, had decided to camp at Blackwater Woods, a secluded forest far from any town. They had heard about the place through an online forum filled with stories of haunted encounters and strange sightings. For them, it was a challenge, a thrill-seeking adventure. The deeper they drove into the forest, the narrower the dirt road became. Trees, tall and menacing, loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The eerie silence of the woods surrounded them, and even the chirping of crickets seemed absent. Finally, they reached a small clearing and set up their tents. As the night progressed, they gathered around the campfire, laughing and sharing ghost stories. Mark, the most skeptical of the group, rolled his eyes as Chris recounted a local legend. "Supposedly, this place is cursed," Chris said, his voice dropping to a whisper for dramatic effect. "They say the forest is home to the Wendigo, a spirit that can mimic voices. It lures people deep into the woods by calling their names, then they disappear without a trace." Tom smirked, poking at the fire with a stick. "Oh, please, it's just another made-up story to scare off campers." Megan, however, seemed uncomfortable. "I read about this place online. People have gone missing here. Not just a few, dozens over the last few decades. Their bodies were never found." Sarah shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "Can we not talk about this? It's creeping me out." The conversation shifted, but an uneasy silence settled over them. The night air grew colder, and a strange mist began to roll in from the trees, swirling around their campsite. It felt wrong, almost unnatural. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, they heard a voice. It was faint but unmistakable. "Help me." Everyone went quiet, listening intently. The voice was distant but distinct, a woman's voice trembling with fear. "Did you guys hear that?" Megan asked, her eyes wide. Mark shook his head. "It's probably just the wind." But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, help me." Sarah shot up, her face pale. "That sounded like a real person. We have to go check." Chris grabbed his flashlight. "She could be hurt or lost. We can't just ignore it." Against their better judgment, the group headed into the woods, the beam of Chris's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The mist clung to their legs as they walked, swirling and twisting as if alive. The voice kept calling, leading them deeper into the forest. "Hello?" Tom called out. "Where are you?" But there was no response, just the distant sound of the woman's voice, repeating the same plea. "Help me." The further they went, the thicker the mist became. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches hanging low like bony arms reaching out. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Megan looked back over her shoulder, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching them. "I don't like this," she whispered. "It feels like we're being led somewhere." Mark was about to respond when the voice changed. It was no longer distant. It was right behind them. "Help me." They spun around, but there was no one there. Just the mist and the dark silhouettes of trees. Sarah clutched Tom's arm. "What's going on? This isn't right." Chris aimed his flashlight in all directions, his hands shaking. "Hello? Where are you?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, from every direction, they heard it. The same voice, overlapping as if dozens of women were speaking at once. "Help me. Please." The sound was overwhelming, echoing in their heads, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Panic set in, and they started running back toward the campsite, but the forest seemed different. The path they had taken was gone, replaced by dense underbrush and twisted roots. Mark stumbled and fell, his flashlight rolling away into the darkness. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily. "This doesn't make sense. We came this way." Sarah pointed through the trees, spotting a faint glow. "The campfire! It's over there!" They sprinted toward the light, but As they broke through the tree line, they realized they were not at their campsite. Instead, they were in a small clearing they had never seen before. In the center of the clearing was a fire, but it was cold, giving off no heat. Surrounding the fire were tall figures, their faces obscured by shadow. The friends froze, their eyes darting between the figures. They seemed almost human, but something was off. Their limbs were too long, their movements too slow and deliberate. One of the figures stepped forward, its head tilting as if examining them. "Help me." The voice came from the figure, but its mouth didn't move. The voice sounded distorted, like a recording played on a loop. The other figures began to mimic it, all speaking in unison. "Help me. Help me." Tom took a step back. "What the hell are you?" The figure stepped closer, and in the light of the fire, they could see its face. It was a mask of stretched skin, eyes black and hollow. It wasn't human. It was something wearing a human's face. Mark's scream shattered the silence, and they all turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. The whispering voices followed them, getting louder, filling their heads with a cacophony of, "Help me! Please, help me." They ran blindly until they broke through the trees and found themselves back at their campsite. The fire was out, and their tents were slashed open, belongings scattered across the ground. Panting and terrified, they jumped into their car. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, away from Blackwater Woods. It wasn't until they reached the main highway that they dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Chris shook his head, staring straight ahead. "I don't know, but it wasn't human." Megan was crying, clutching her knees to her chest. "It was mimicking us. It wanted us to follow it." As they drove away, none of them noticed the figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching them leave. It was tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow. From the darkness, they could still hear the voice, whispering faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of the engine. "Help me." They never spoke about that night again, but they could never forget it. And deep in the forest, the voice still echoes, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to answer its call. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine as Jake, Lisa, and their friends, Mike and Rachel, set up camp deep in the red pine forest. They had chosen this spot for its isolation, wanting a weekend away from the city's noise. It was a perfect place for stargazing and telling spooky stories around the campfire. They were experienced campers and had visited many forests, but Red Pine was new to them, known for its eerie quietness and thick, towering trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they gathered around the campfire, laughing and sharing stories. The light from the fire danced across their faces, casting long shadows that flickered against the trees. Jake, always the storyteller, decided to share a local legend he had read about online. "Ever hear of the Red Pine Wraith?" he asked, his voice low and serious. Rachel scoffed. "You and your creepy stories, Jake. What is it this time?" Jake grinned. "They say she's a woman who got lost in these woods 100 years ago. She was never found, but her spirit wanders, calling out to anyone who dares camp here. If you hear her voice, it means she's chosen you." Lisa shivered, glancing around the dark forest. "Chosen for what?" Jake leaned closer, his face illuminated eerily by the firelight. "For company. Forever. People say they hear her sobbing at night, calling their names. If you hear her, don't follow the voice. No one who does ever comes back." Mike laughed, trying to shake off the goosebumps that prickled his skin. Yeah, whatever. We'll be fine." But as the laughter died down, a cold breeze swept through the camp, making the flames flicker. The forest, usually filled with the sound of nocturnal animals, was silent. Too silent. As the night wore on, they decided to turn in. Jake and Lisa shared a tent, while Mike and Rachel took the other. The fire died down, leaving only the faint glow of embers as the forest swallowed them in darkness. It was around 2 a.m. when Lisa awoke with a start. She thought she had heard something, a faint, muffled sound. She held her breath, listening. There it was again. It sounded like crying. She nudged Jake awake. "Jake, listen," she whispered. Jake, groggy, strained his ears. At first he heard nothing. Then there it was. A soft, distant sobbing, like a woman crying. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. He frowned. "Probably just an animal or something." But Lisa shook her head. "No, that's not an animal. That's a person." Against their better judgment, they crawled out of the tent and looked toward the trees. The sound was clearer now, unmistakable. It was a woman crying, pleading softly. "Help me, please." Rachel and Mike emerged from their tent, equally disturbed. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, her face pale. "Someone's out there. Hilarious," Mike said, his voice tinged with fear. "Maybe they're hurt." Jake hesitated, remembering the story he had told earlier, but his rational mind dismissed it. "We should check it out. If someone's hurt, we can't just leave them." They grabbed their flashlights and headed into the woods, following the sound. The sobbing grew louder, filled with a pain that sent shivers down their spines. It was as if the forest itself was amplifying the noise, guiding them deeper into the darkness. The mist began to roll in, thickening the air around them, and the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath formed puffs of white in the cold night air. The crying continued, sounding agonizingly close, but somehow always out of reach. "Where are you?" Rachel called out, her voice shaking. "We're here to help." But there was no response, just the relentless sobbing. It felt as if they had been walking for hours, but when they turned back to check their path, the campsite was no longer visible. The trees around them looked different, gnarled and twisted as if contorted by some unseen force. Suddenly, the sobbing stopped. The silence was deafening. The four of them stood there, flashlights scanning the area, their breaths shallow and rapid. "Maybe we should go back," Lisa whispered. "This doesn't feel right." Just as they turned to leave, a voice, clear and cold, whispered from the darkness, "Don't go." The beam of Mike's flashlight landed on a figure standing a few feet away. It was a woman dressed in a torn, dirty white gown. Her hair was matted, and her face was obscured by shadows. She stood there, motionless, her head tilted slightly as if observing them. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, taking a cautious step forward. The woman's head snapped up, and they could see her face clearly now. Her eyes were hollow, black voids, and her mouth twisted into a sorrowful smile. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody that seemed to echo from all around. Rachel screamed, dropping her flashlight. The figure lunged at them, dissolving into mist as it reached them. The cold enveloped them, and they felt a pressure on their chests, like icy hands squeezing their hearts. "Run!" Mike shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her along. They sprinted through the forest, the sound of footsteps following close behind, though when they glanced back, there was no one there. The crying started again, louder and more frantic, echoing in their ears. "Help me, please, don't leave me." They burst into the clearing of their campsite, panting and drenched in sweat despite the cold. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. They scrambled into their tents, zipping them up tightly and huddled together, too terrified to speak. The rest of the night passed slowly. They didn't hear the crying again, but they felt watched, as if a pair of unseen eyes were fixed on them from the darkness just beyond the edge of the campsite. As dawn broke, they wasted no time packing up. The forest, bathed in morning light, seemed less threatening, but the sense of dread lingered. They piled into the car, and as they drove away, no one spoke. The memory of the woman's hollow eyes and sorrowful smile was burned into their minds. They reached the edge of the forest and stopped for gas at a small, run-down station. The attendant, an elderly man with a knowing look, noticed their pale faces. "Y'all come from Red Pine?" he asked, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. Jake nodded, still shaken. "Yeah, we were camping." The old man's face turned grim. "You see her, didn't you? The Wraith?" Lisa's eyes widened. "You've heard of her?" He nodded slowly. "Everyone around here knows she's been haunting those woods for as long as anyone can remember. Lures people in with her crying. You're lucky to have made it out." Jake swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Why does she do it?" The attendant sighed, looking out towards the forest. "She's lonely, I suppose. Died out there all alone, and now she's looking for company. Just be glad she didn't find what she was looking for in you." The friends exchanged uneasy glances. Without another word, they got back in the car and drove away, vowing never to return to Red Pine Forest. But as they sped down the road, Lisa thought she heard, faintly, almost drowned out by the wind, the sound of a woman crying, calling their names one last time. "Help me." The sun had just set as Kyle, Emma, and their friend Nathan arrived at the isolated campsite near the old Crystal Lake. It was a perfect spot, far away from civilization, where they could relax and escape the stress of everyday life. The dense forest surrounded the lake, its reflection casting an eerie shimmer on the water. They set up their tents, lit a campfire, and laughed as they roasted marshmallows. The forest was unusually quiet, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Nathan decided to tell an unsettling story he had heard about this place. "You guys know why this place is called Crystal Lake?" Nathan began, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "There's a legend about a man named Jeremiah. He lived in a cabin not far from here, about 50 years ago. People said he was strange, always mumbling to himself, always alone. They say he would stare into the lake for hours, like he was searching for something." Emma shivered. "And what happened to him?" "One night he disappeared," Nathan continued. "The townsfolk searched everywhere but found nothing. A week later, someone spotted a figure standing on the shore of the lake at midnight. They thought it was Jeremiah, but when they got closer, he vanished into the water without a trace. Since then, people say his ghost haunts this place, appearing as a shadow on the water waiting for anyone who dares camp here." Kyle laughed nervously. "Nice story, Nathan, trying to scare us already?" But Nathan's expression was dead serious. "It's not just a story. My uncle was a ranger here. He said he saw the shadow once and swore never to come back." The mood around the campfire shifted. The wind picked up, making the flames dance higher. They decided to call it a night and retreated to their tents, though sleep didn't come easily. It was around 3 a.m. when Kyle heard something. He opened his eyes, listening. It was faint at first, like a whispering voice carried by the wind. He glanced over at Emma, who was still asleep. He nudged her gently. "Emma, wake up," he whispered. She stirred, groggy. "What is it?" "Listen," Kyle said. The whispering grew louder. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the lake. Emma's eyes widened. "Do you hear that?" Nathan, who was in the tent next to them, unzipped his tent and poked his head out. "What's going on? You hear it too?" Emma asked. The whispering grew louder, and now it was unmistakable. A low, murmuring voice coming from the lake. It was speaking, but they couldn't make out the words. It sounded like it was calling, beckoning them closer. Despite their fear, curiosity got the better of them. They grabbed their flashlights and crept towards the water's edge. The moon was high, casting a silver glow over the lake, but the surface of the water was oddly still, like glass. As they shone their flashlights across the lake, they saw it, a dark, human-like shadow standing on the water. It was facing them, its head tilted, as if watching. "What is that?" Emma gasped, gripping Kyle's arm. Nathan's face was pale. "It's him. It's Jeremiah." The shadow began to move towards them, gliding silently over the surface of the lake. They took a step back, get out, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. Then the whispering turned into a low, guttural voice. "Come closer. Help me." Emma's eyes filled with terror. "We need to go. Now." But as they turned to run, Nathan froze. His eyes were locked onto the shadow. I can hear him," he whispered. "He's saying my name." Kyle grabbed Nathan's arm. "Nathan, snap out of it!" But Nathan was already stepping towards the lake, like he was in a trance. The shadow's hand reached out, a dark silhouette against the moonlit water. "Nathan, stop!" Emma screamed. Kyle lunged forward, grabbing Nathan before he could take another step. With a forceful tug, he pulled Nathan back, and they both tumbled onto the shore. The shadow halted, retracting its hand. It seemed to hover there for a moment, staring at them, before slowly sinking into the water, disappearing without a ripple. The whispering faded into silence. The three friends scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding. "We're leaving. Now," Kyle said, his voice trembling. They rushed back to their campsite, hastily throwing their belongings into their bags. As they packed, they noticed something strange. The ground around their tents was wet, as if it had rained, but only in this small area. The lake was nearly 100 feet away. The wet footprints led directly from the water to their tents and then disappeared. Emma's face was ashen. "We need to go now." They didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their gear and ran to their car. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the narrow, winding road, the dark forest closing in around them. As they drove, Emma glanced in the rearview mirror. Her face went pale. "Look!" she cried. Kyle looked in the mirror. There, in the middle of the road, was the shadowy figure, standing perfectly still, watching them as they drove away. Its eyes glowed a faint, eerie white. They didn't slow down until they were miles away from the campsite. The shadow never followed, but the feeling of being watched lingered. They made a pact that night never to speak of what they had seen. But each of them knew they would never forget the dark figure standing on the water, the cold whisper of its falling out, and the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to disturb its eternal vigil. The moon hung high above the dense forest as four friends, Sarah, Mike, Jenna, and Tom, decided to set up camp near Blackwood Creek. It was an isolated area, known mostly to seasoned campers. They wanted a real adventure, something away from the crowded campsites they were used to. The air was crisp, the smell of pine strong in their noses as they pitched their tents and gathered around a roaring campfire. They joked and laughed, sharing stories of their week. The laughter echoed through the trees, but when it died down, the forest was eerily silent. Jenna shivered. "It's so quiet out here. It's almost unsettling." Tom smirked. "Perfect for a scary story, don't you think?" Mike grinned and leaned forward. "I've got one. Have you ever heard of the Whistler of Blackwood Creek?" Sarah's eyebrows knitted together. "The Whistler? What's that?" Mike's face took on a serious expression. "Legend has it that a long time ago, a trapper named Garrett used to live around here. He was a loner, hated people, and the only time he would interact with anyone was to sell pelts. One winter, he went missing. People searched, but all they found was his empty cabin with strange symbols carved into the walls and ceiling. The night he vanished, the locals heard a strange whistling sound coming from the woods. Since then, campers have reported hearing the same eerie whistling at night, and those who go searching for it, well, they never come back." Jenna rolled her eyes. "Nice try, Mike. Trying to scare us already?" Mike shrugged, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Suit yourself. But if you hear whistling tonight, you'll know what it is." They laughed it off, but as the night wore on, an uneasy feeling settled over the group. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. They decided to call it a night, crawling into their sleeping bags inside their tents. It was around 2 a.m. when Sarah jolted awake. She couldn't say why, but something had pulled her from sleep. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow on the tents. She lay there, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves, when she heard it. A soft, melodic whistle drifting through the trees. Her heart skipped a beat. She strained to listen, hoping it was just her imagination, but the whistling continued, growing slightly louder. It was a tune she didn't recognize, slow and haunting, like someone trying to lull a child to sleep. Sarah quietly unzipped her tent and peered outside. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, but she saw nothing out of the ordinary. She glanced over at the others' tents. Jenna and Tom's tent was still, but Mike's tent zipper was partially open, flapping gently in the wind. A cold shiver ran down her spine. "Mike?" she whispered, but there was no response. Sarah crept out of her tent, her breath misting in the cold night air. She tiptoed to Mike's tent and peeked inside. It was empty. The sleeping bag was unzipped, tossed aside. The whistling grew louder, and this time it seemed to be coming from the direction of the creek. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. What if Mike had gone to investigate? She knew it was a terrible idea, but she couldn't leave him out there alone. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made her way towards the creek, the soft earth squishing under her boots. The whistling continued, the same eerie tune floating through the air. When she reached the creek, she scanned the area with her flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but she saw nothing but trees and the glint of water. She was about to turn back when the whistling stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. She held her breath, listening. "Mike?" She called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. She was about to head back to camp when she saw something out of the corner of her eye, a shadow standing on the other side of the creek. She swung her flashlight around, and the beam landed on a figure standing in the darkness. It was tall and thin, its face hidden under the brim of an old hat. "Mike?" she whispered again, but she knew this wasn't him. The figure lifted its head, revealing a pale, gaunt face. Its eyes were hollow, empty voids staring straight at her. Slowly, it raised a hand to its mouth and began to whistle the same haunting tune. Sarah's blood ran cold. She took a step back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. It just kept whistling, the sound growing louder and more distorted, like a broken flute. The tune was no longer soft and melodic. It was sharp and grating, a sound that drilled into her skull. Sarah turned and ran, her feet pounding against the ground as she sprinted back to camp. She could still hear the whistling behind her, growing louder and closer as if the figure was right on her heels. When she burst into the clearing, she found Jenna and Tom standing outside their tent looking terrified. "Sarah, what's going on?" Jenna cried. "It's him," Sarah panted. "The Whistler. He's real." Tom grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the trees. For a moment, there was nothing. Then they saw it. The figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its hollow eyes gleaming in the moonlight. It lifted its hand and started whistling again, the tune sharp and dissonant. "Get in the car," Tom yelled. They scrambled towards the car, fumbling with the keys. The whistling grew louder, now almost deafening. It felt like it was coming from inside their heads. Jenna managed to unlock the doors, and they all piled in. Tom started the engine, his hands shaking. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the trees ahead. The figure was gone. "Go! Go!" Sarah screamed. Tom floored the gas pedal, and the car sped down the narrow dirt road, the tires kicking up dust. The whistling continued, fading into the distance as they drove, until finally there was silence. They didn't stop until they reached the main road, miles away from the campsite. Only then did they dare to breathe. "What the hell was that?" Jenna whispered, her face pale. "I don't know," Tom said, his voice shaking. "But we're never coming back here." Sarah nodded in agreement, still hearing the faint echo of the whistling in her ears. It was a sound she knew she would never forget, a haunting melody that would stay with her forever. As they drove away, none of them noticed the figure standing by the side of the road, watching them go. Its pale face split into a wide, unnatural grin, and the sound of a slow, eerie whistle carried on the wind.